Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on from where you are watching. You are tuning into a Sundance Film Festival Beyond Film panel brought to you by the Roxy Theater in San Francisco. My name is Rick Norris, and I'm a programmer here at the Roxy, which of course has been closed since last March. But we remain committed to sharing great works of art and conversation in the virtual space. We are honored to have been designated as the Northern California satellite screen for Sundance 2021. And we are thrilled that we are going to be presenting 12 festival features at our COVID-proof drive-in looking out onto the San Francisco Bay at Fort Mason. The running time of this previously recorded panel is approximately 1 hour. Entitled Film Criticism in the Time of COVID, our assembled panel is composed of some of the most distinguished film writers being published today. If you were like me and thousands of others who trek to Park City each year, our panel is a group who we count on to either tell us which is the must-see film of the moment and or who we are reading months later after the dust is settled. If we are lucky, we might spy them in the Yarrow lobby or grab a word as they take a breather at the Fresh Market. But today, they are all ours, and it is my delight to introduce them now. Randy Myers is a freelance film journalist for the San Jose Mercury News, Local News Matters, and the Bay Area News Group. He's also a cherished member in good standing of the San Francisco Bay Area Film Critics Circle. We are delighted you could make it today, Randy.
Well, thank you, Rick. Thanks so much for having me here. I really appreciate it. Just love to be on this panel.
Thank you. B. Ruby Rich is an American scholar and critic of independent Latin American documentary, feminist, and queer films, as well as professor emerita of film and digital media and social documentation at UC Santa Cruz. She is the current editor of Film Quarterly, published by University of California. Her own Sundance Beyond Film panel, Barbed Wire Kisses, promises to be one of the more popular discussions of this fest. Ruby, thanks so much for dropping in.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
Pam Grady is a San Francisco freelance writer who contributes to the San Francisco Chronicle, 48 Hills, and other publications. Her website, cinezinekane.com, is a movie site devoted to celebrating the best in movies and skewering the worst. They will have their cake and eat it too. She is a member and has held the position of president of the San Francisco Bay Area Film Critics Association. Thanks for joining today, Pam.
Hey, Rick.
Justin Chang is a film critic and columnist for the Los Angeles Times. He reviews films for NPR's Fresh Air and is a regular contributor to KPCC's Film Week. Before joining the Times, he was chief film critic at Variety, and he is the author of the book Filmcraft, Cohen editing. He serves as chair of the National Society of Film Critics and secretary of the Los Angeles Film Critics Association. Thanks so much for being here today, Justin. Lisa Kennedy writes on popular culture, race, and gender, among other topics, and has for more than 2 decades. From 2003 to 2015, she was film critic for the Denver Post. In 2012, she added theater critic to her beat. She's been published in the New York Times, Essence Magazine, American Theater, Newsday, CNN.com, AARP.com, and Variety. Before becoming a full-time writer, she was an editor at the Village Voice. Welcome, Lisa.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
We're delighted. Originally from Mexico City, Carlos Aguilar was chosen as one of the 6 young film critics to partake in the very first Roger Ebert Fellowship, organized by RogerEbert.com, the Sundance Institute, and Indiewire in 2014. Aguilar's work has appeared in the Los Angeles Times, Variety, New York Times, The Wrap, Indiewire, Vulture, RogerEbert.com, Movie Maker Magazine, and Filmmaker Magazine, among others. He is a member of the Los Angeles Film Critics Association. Carlos, I really appreciate that you could make it this morning.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here with this great group of writers.
Our moderator today is Eric Cohen, the New York-based executive editor and chief critic at Indiewire. In addition to overseeing operations for Indiewire's New York film team, he reviews numerous films throughout the year, oversees festival strategy, and reports on the industry. Back in the day, Eric traveled to film festivals around the globe, and he's still interviewing filmmakers and manages Critic Wire, Indiewire's network for professional film critics. Prior to joining Indiewire in 2007, Eric contributed to the New York Times and other outlets. Eric, it's an honor.
Thank you for having me. So are we good to go? Should I get this party started?
You know, at this point, I'm going to depart. And again, our deepest gratitude to each and every one of you for gracing us with your presence today. Have a great discussion.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much.
Rick.
Thanks a lot.
This is the first kind of gathering associated with Sundance that I'm experiencing. So thank you all for being here. I'm missing the opportunity to be at high altitudes and dashing through the snow, trying to stay on schedule and hopelessly failing. But at the same time, you know, really the essence of the Sundance experience, I think for a lot of us, is connecting with colleagues and talking about the state of the industry, the work that we do, and the way that it keeps changing. And I should preface this conversation by saying I'm basically an optimist about the ongoing vitality of cultural journalism and film criticism in particular, in spite of the many, many reasons to argue against that. And I'm sure there will be some that come up over the course of this discussion. But a big reason for my optimism is that for the last 15 years, I've always started my year going to Sundance. This would have been my 15th year at Park City. And I always come out of that experience feeling like I've got this head full of new cinema that is about to be introduced in different kinds of ways, but also just from the conversations that are stimulated by that kind of collection of voices who can then sort of establish the life that these films have, as well as the way the industry chooses to talk about them. So whether or not the media is always in the best place to support what film critics do, it does seem to me like this is a very exciting time to be writing about the movies and sort of wrestling with the impact they have on society and so forth. So going from that as a starting point, I wanted to talk a bit about the kind of ecosystem that criticism exists within, because a lot of times when people talk about film critics, they're not looking at the sheer variety of voices and the way that they come out into, or the way that they manifest in as criticism. And one of the things that I like about the collection of voices we have here today is that we have such a range of different ways that criticism manifests itself. We've got several freelancers, and I want to start with you to talk about the work that you do, and then we'll go into the work that Ruby and Justin, that you do in more specific kind of targeted ways, because I think that contrast should be illuminating. So Randy, why don't you kick us off and tell us a bit about, as a freelancer for the San Jose Mercury News, how do you sort of wind up choosing what you write about and push back on whatever kind of limitations the publications that you work for have to kind of figure out what you can get away with?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much, Eric. What I try to do when I will talk to my editor and we'll plot what we're going to be doing. It has changed over the course of COVID time when I'm writing articles, mainly because we are doing them as about 10 reviews in one portion. One article, and I'll break out one, like I did Wonder Woman 1984. I did that as a separate, but since there's so much out there and we're trying to get it so that we're also having some indie films, a lot of indie film support there, because there's so many great films with that that we're seeing, tied into being actually with the indie movie houses, such as the Roxy and other ones, that's the platform where they can see them, at the same time support indie films. So I'll be selecting a lot of those in combination. I don't get much pushback for what I'm going to be reviewing. I mean, it's the broad expanse. There's so much out there, so I don't think that it's particularly ever limited from the editor standpoint. It's me coming up, looking at the releases and seeing those in time and trying to get up at 4:30 in the morning to watch them because that's usually the time now that I start watching the films because that's so fresh. There are no interruptions, correct, when you're right there. Versus at night, we're seeing movies under different circumstances, I believe, and that's where it becomes an issue that you want to be so concentrated and focused on what you're seeing. So I get up early in the morning. Some people, that's at night. I know my good friend Pam, that's a way for her is nighttime.
So Pam, why don't you take it from there? Tell us a bit about your work as a freelancer for San Francisco Chronicle and sort of how the local conditions dictate that versus when you choose to write on your own site and sort of finding that balance.
Well, for the Chronicle, I mainly work on features and profiles, which, as you can imagine, with the pandemic has been less. I'm covering Sundance, which I'm very happy about, one of the team there. But it's, God, I'm being really inarticulate. It's just the pandemic has definitely, I mean, I picked up 48 Hills, so I picked up a new outlet during the pandemic, which helped. But in terms of like, I long ago stopped doing reviews for money, mainly because I didn't want, I got to the point where I just could not write one more review of a movie I didn't want to see in the first place. And also because an editor swapped out my Avatar review when the fanboys didn't like it, even though the fanboys hadn't seen it.
Wow.
So I write for the Alliance of Women's Film Journalists, mainly concentrating on women filmmakers. And then whatever for Citizen Kane, it's like, I concentrate on the small releases, the foreign releases, the things that I want to write about.
And Carlos, you are writing for everyone these days. It's sort of an interesting kind of model, I think, that's worth looking at because I remember when you first started, just a few years ago, you had a couple of places that you were sort of regularly contributing to, and now it seems like you've really diversified your portfolio. So why don't you tell us a bit about how you got to that point and the way that you're sort of assessing the different ways that you can work as a critic these days?
Yeah, I mean, it's been sort of a incremental sort of way, as you say, I started with a couple outlets, trying to find those spaces where, specifically I have a inherent interest for Latino film or Latino filmmakers. So there was, something like Remezcla where I would focus on writing about those films. And eventually I feel like it was very, a sort of, an incremental kind of way in which I, really took a chance and started reaching out to other outlets and kind of hoping that eventually there will be an opportunity like the LA Times or the New York Times. Those are all opportunities that as I been attending festivals and meeting people and connecting with other critics have presented themselves. And it's an interesting sort of format, as you say, to be writing for so many different people and finding which outlets might have an interest in in a foreign language film or in an animated film, and trying to write about everything I want to write about without being tied to a single outlet or whatnot. There's also some outlets like the LA Times that will assign me a film that I didn't have any interest in, and that gives me sort of a chance to also force myself to write about movies that I don't have an interest in, which is a good exercise, I feel.
And we're going to let Justin respond to that in just a moment. But first, let's go to Lisa. So Lisa, you have seen criticism go through, I would say, a couple of different phases. And you were at the Denver Post for long enough, I think, probably to see a couple of those happen, just given that between the beginning of the previous, let's say 2 decades ago, the beginning of the aughts
Sure.
to 2015, so much happened. So tell us a bit about the kind of changes you've seen and how they inform the work you're doing today.
Well, I think that it's interesting that Randy, I think, works for a paper that was sort of in the umbrella of the Denver Post. And I'm like, they have a film critic still, kind of thing, because that was one of the sort of first things that kind of got not let go, because I fought to keep a hybrid of film and theater, because theater was fairly robust and very local in Denver as well. And so I think you're right. I mean, one of the things is that when places were looking to contract their coverage, and especially print journalism, especially daily print journalism, they look to the film sections a lot because there's some great critics that you can pick up on Wire and have in your paper. And I could argue as an editor why that's not the best solution to the issue. But as a writer, I don't, because I feel like it's a conflict of interest to argue vigorously for why you should keep film local in a certain way. But there were reasons. So there's that, and and Denver's never really recovered. I mean, when I took a buyout and became a freelancer, I still had lots of opportunities to write about theater in Denver, but almost zero opportunities to write about film in Denver, unless I'm writing about it for, or some national publications, and not for the Post, which turns out to be, I'm a very lazy pitcher. It's like when you've worked as a critic at a paper for your whole life, it's like there's no pitching to be done. And now it's like, oh my God, I'm listening to what Carlos is talking about. I'm like, oh, I'm so lazy. It's terrible. But it's been interesting because I think it's a real loss for a city that actually has still a robust, and Denver does, a very robust film going community. We have a film center, that has films 365 days of the year and has this massive festival. I mean, all of these things are sort of bracketed by the pandemic, but they will come back. And in fact, Denver Film is one of the satellite houses, theater houses, art houses for the Sundance Festival this year. But it's definitely been different. I mean, there's a Denver Film Critics Society, but they're almost all writing for online, and almost always have written for online. Most of those writers, and they're a really interesting group of people.
Yeah.
But it feels like a really different community.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to that point in just a minute, but I want to come to Justin. So we'll move from Denver to Los Angeles and into a place that's gone through its own changes since you've started there. When I think when you became the critic at LA Times, moving over from Variety, Kenny Turan was still there. So he's left. You're basically the staff film critic and have to juggle what is, now a very complicated release calendar for all kinds of reasons, but even, pre the strangeness of 2020 would have been, just a deluge of films. So how do you sort of juggle the kind of expectations of the role you have versus, decisions, as Carlos mentioned, to sort of farm out to the freelancers in your roster?
With great difficulty, and probably not much effectiveness. But I'll start by saying I don't assign any of the reviews myself. I used to do that in my capacity as chief critic at Variety and film reviews editor, and it was wonderful. It was hard, and I think it's harder now. It's a joy to have Carlos's byline in the LA Times, whether he's writing about movies he loves or movies he did not ask for. And having been there myself, just the kind of taking on whatever is thrown at you, whether by an editor or just by the festival, that is, it's like I miss it, but I don't miss it as well. I feel so fortunate to have my job as a full-time critic. I know how scarce they are. I know how blessed I am. It's an enormous privilege. And I miss Kenny terribly. Sorry, it's just your question, Eric, unleashed this whirlwind of things, because we're all still in this. And for me, it's been dealing with different levels of change and loss. Kenny and I had 4 fantastic years writing alongside each other. And I remember being crushed when I heard he was leaving. And then when it was right, I think he left in April, and then the pandemic had obviously set in. We're like, wow, you're getting out at just the right time. So, and then it's hard because, as we all know, there are still so many movies. I mean, people who don't follow movies think, oh, there's no movies. And it's like, no, there's just no Hollywood movies. There's no studio movies, but there are tons and tons of movies. And I have not written about as many as I would like this past year. I think we're all just working from home sucks. What can I say? I mean, it's just really, and I'm not singling myself out there. I think we all just know the challenges of that. So I have been trying. I mean, I still have enjoy the freedom to be able to choose what I want to write about. I feel like I've written more positive reviews this past year than I ever have, just because of the abundance of terrific the unsurprising abundance of terrific independent international films, documentaries, whatnot. And as the focus has shifted there, it's like I think I want to focus my energy and attention on good films that people will want to see during this tough time and later when we're through it.
That's a really nice idea. This sense of criticism as advocacy has never been more prominent on a lot of people's mind. Well, Ruby, I wanted to come to you last on this so you had a chance to sort of absorb what everyone was saying, because one of the things I love doing is picking up the new issue of Film Quarterly and reading your editor's letter, because when it comes out, there's all this stuff that happens in the world, and most of us have to process it every day with new takes on everything that's happening. And what you do is you kind of look at the big picture. So I wanted to give you a chance to kind of give us that big picture in terms of where criticism is right now, because yes, there have been some really troubling things happening in the world, but as Justin said, there's also a lot of great films that have been coming out however they can. So what role do you think criticism has had to play in all of this?
Wow, that's a big assignment you just handed me, Eric. But I think I want to quote Lisa. I think maybe I'm just lazy. That's why I only write these 4 times a year, right? And I have to cram into it every time what I've been doing. And luckily, they're free on the web on the Film Quarterly site, so people can look at them if they're so moved. But I would say that it's been a really confusing time, probably for all of us, because we write about film and maybe some of us television, streaming, other kinds of intermediate work, but essentially we're all such tribal animals. We live for screenings and festivals, and it's like our kind of modern day Elks Club. Let's face it. It's as much about feeling the pulse in the room as it is about paying attention to what's on screen and reacting. So I think it's been tough to get through this almost year. But at the same time, I think it's really a challenge in terms of our being forced to sift through this kind of abundance of material without the usual ways of sorting. I mean, it used to be, if you're going to a festival, what was your budget? How many could you go to in a year? Or what could you do close to home? And now suddenly all of that has collapsed. I mean, geo-blocking be damned, but all of it has kind of collapsed in on us. And we're trying to I feel like Lucy in the Chocolate Factory, trying to keep up with this conveyor belt of films coming at us and wanting to make sure that the important ones don't get overlooked and that the films we care about really get attention. And I just had the bizarre experience of being on a jury, right, on remote. And I was on the Doc Leipzig jury and then wrote about it for Film Quarterly. And it was unsettling, it was, on the one hand, it was wonderful to have jury meetings and be able to talk to other critics. But at the same time, there was something strange about having to be in charge of my own screening and not being in Leipzig and not having that version of the local, maybe it's not the local critic on staff at a paper, but you kind of absorb the local when you do a film festival, and you bring your own local to it when you do a screening. And now suddenly my own local is in my living room. I mean, I don't care for that particularly. On the other hand, I've had the other challenge, which is that I really relocated over to Paris in August. So I'm speaking from almost locked down Paris. And it's been a huge problem in terms of timetables. I had to laugh, at Randy's story, but I'm very challenged, okay, with that. But I think that for all of us, I think the challenge is what is important right now in film and what is important right now in criticism, and what matters. I mean, we're kind of left with that. What matters right at this moment? What are we looking for? We used to make fun of people in the Depression who watched Busby Berkeley movies as escapism. So now I guess it's, sci-fi films or, comic-based films or animations. Or has there been a film made in the past 4 years of this administration that dealt with the kind of political issues that have been going on for 4 years? I haven't seen it. Maybe somebody has. Todd Haynes' Dark Waters last year was one of the only ones I saw in this whole period to try to take on this web of corruption. But I just wonder, what do we expect from films right now as critics? What do we expect the audiences that we write for to be paying attention to or demanding? I mean, I would end with that, really.
That's a wonderful question, because it also ties into the ecosystem for criticism these days, which takes on so many more forms than it used to. And I think there is an important cultural question that you bring up about whether or not these films are engaging with the world the way that we'd like to see them engage, and that's something we should certainly dig into. But I think it's also a question of how are critics responding to films and making those arguments, because we've heard for probably a decade plus that the internet could be this antichrist for for a lot of things, but certainly for the work that we're talking about here. And I'm curious to hear from everyone on this panel about how you relate to the changing nature of information and the way it impacts the work that you do. Lisa, I wanted to come back to you because you mentioned all of these Denver critics who are now online based. So what is your sense of kind of the online arena and the discourse that happens there? Do you think that's overall had a constructive impact in the nature of conversation about films and in terms of the sort of local environment that you work in?
Well, in terms of the local environment, I don't think so necessarily, but in terms of sort of the national environment, I think it does. I mean, there are people asking a different set of questions. There are writers that we would never have had an opportunity to read just because of the things that we're talking about, sort of economics, but also just the kind of default to kind of hiring the people that you see and the people that are in your sort of bubble of sorts. And while people in LA and New York don't think they're in a bubble, when they're making those choices as editors, they are clearly in a bubble sometimes. So it's nice to see that there've been all these sort of things like Shadow and Act that like have a bunch of writers that, speak and sort of are engaged with, if they're not critics, they're at least engaged with the stories that are coming out in ways that I think are very illuminating and broaden the conversation. Denver's, the way I feel about that is that, that sort of criticism has been online, and we've talked about it and wrung our hands about it for, more than probably like a decade now, kind of thing, where it's just like everybody's a critic. And so quite honestly, I'm amazed when editors find really wonderful writers from online to then bring into a different kind of folder, a different kind of platform, because I think that I don't necessarily look to those folks just because I can only consume so much information, and I like really beautiful writing. So it's not like I just want to know that a movie's good or bad. I'm actually way more interested in whether the critic writes beautifully and I have their ideas and that sort of inspire. So that's kind of what, I don't think it's been, I mean, like so many things from the internet, it's not a pure evil or pure good thing at all. It's almost never a pure good thing, but it's not a pure evil thing. It's just one of those things where you just have to make more choices about how much information, how many writers, how many people you can follow that you think are really interesting and adding to the conversation. And that's a little bit of a personal filter as much as a professional one. So I tend to default to the writers I already have loved a lot and then trust that they like writers and then look at them and go, okay, these people are really interesting.
So Pam and Randall, off of that, maybe you can talk a bit about how being sort of plugged into the online conversation around a movie informs the kinds of opportunities that you pursue as critics. Pam, why don't you go first?
I'm not sure. Randy should go first because my brain is having freezes clearly.
It's fine. It's a bit abstract, but I think some people may know where I'm getting at here. So Randy, why don't you take that?
Yeah, I think with a lot of things that we have that are as far as like online, it does sort of guide you in a certain way because there's so many things that are out there for having opinion-based, whether it's criticism or it's just commenting about film, that you have this vast array of things. So I see the role that what I would play is seeing what's out there too, but discovering what my perspective is and how the films films would then gravitate to me to review. And I could be a person who just might be talking about Marvel films all the time. Let's just talk about that, right? I'm not that expert, right? But so I will look at it from a different perspective. I might not be an expert on a certain topic, but my is taking these films that have been discussed, and to filter it through my lens as well and see the principles of criticism. Does it work as a film? Does it work in this way? You can get sideways with discussions on topics that don't exactly pertain to the film sometime. And I think that trying to get away from the fanfare of films or the actual adulation for a certain genre where you come in, I think that can be actually where we come in and offer something that's a little bit different in that way. There's nothing the matter with that. There's a great thing to have that, but I think there's also to have that sense too from a different perspective.
Right. It's almost like there's some extra noise going on that gets in the way of the more sort of targeted conversations that aren't driven by marketing hype or expectations of the fans. So let me give this back to Pam because
yeah. I think I can clarify my thoughts. I think Randy's getting to it where there's just so much information out there that it can be hard to get out of the weeds. And I end up relying on both things that, just something that will, if I'm reading Indiewire or Variety or whatever small, friends blogs, that shelf in Canada, I really like. And they'll turn me on to things, or I'll hear from I have so many critic friends. I'll hear about films from them. Filmmakers pitch me all the time, and publicists, of course. And it's just trying to decide what among all that stuff I need to focus my attention on. I tend to like one of my favorite filmmakers is Guy Maddin. So I tend to go for things that are a little bit off, or even a lot off the center.
Right.
I get very, I like the prestige films, but most of the time I don't have a lot of patience that I want to write about them. There's not so much passion because people will find those. I want people to find the films that they're not going to find otherwise.
Right. No, it's a really good point because on some level, those films are doing the work for you. The bigger movies are sort of plugged into a machine that keeps them in the conversation, whether or not they deserve to be there. Sometimes they're really wonderful films, but they're not necessarily reliant on critics to say that they're wonderful films in the same kind of process. Well, Carlos, you're really big on social media, so I wanted to get your perspective on that side of things, because it seems to me, just being aware of your Twitter presence, that it's almost like an extension of the way that you work as a critic, or some sort of way to fuse that identity across all these different places that you're writing. So how has that sort of relationship developed for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I do, of course, I love to write a review or an in-depth piece, but it's been particularly interesting to me when I, go on Twitter and I recommend, an international film that, it's been on Netflix for a few months, but, no one has really paid attention. And then, sometimes those things get more attention and more, feedback than an actual review, which, it's sort of like a bite-sized way of like still curating and recommending this film. So I find Twitter to be very helpful in that sense, that when I hear people, oh, I saw your tweet and I watched this film, that's whether that's true or not, it's really sort of edifying to me to see that, even if it wasn't a review, they're engaging with international cinema, because that's, I post about international cinema all the time. So if they're following me and they find a film that's been on Netflix for a while, and I turn them onto that, I think that's very rewarding to me as someone that that has sort of made the mission of like bringing these films to the foreground, even if it's only to a tweet, if there's no review. So I think that I find that engagement with the audience interesting, and it gives me hope that even if, you know, these viewers might not be going out to the art houses or the film festivals, if they have the access to them and someone says that it's, you know, that is good, that they'll, you know, take a second and go see it. So to me, that's been, like you said, an extension of that sort of like mission of you know, bringing a little more attention to international cinema. For a long time, I kind of fought against being on Twitter so much. I really just got into it maybe 1 or 2 years ago, like sort of heavily being on there. And, you know, it has terrible things, but, you know, very positive sort of engagement with other critics. And like I said, with the audience, that I'm always surprised when they say that they watch an international film because they saw a tweet of mine.
Well, Justin, why don't you weigh in on this? Because one of the things I think is significant about major newspapers like the LA Times is that in recent years, rather than sort of, you know, operating in a separate ecosystem from the online world, there's been this growing sort of acknowledgement that it's all media in the same sort of machine. And I wonder how that informs the conversations you have about going beyond sort of the rank and file process of criticism and reviewing new movies coming to market to figure out other ways of sort of informing the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like, you know, I mean, my Jeff Berkshire, the film editor at the LA Times, is still the person I report to and the one I deal with most closely in terms of assignments. But I talk to our social media editors, audience engagement editors, you know, maybe not almost as much, but, you know, to a great extent, greater than I was maybe a few years ago. And there's just this, in general, there's sort of a gray, throw the spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks kind of approach. And we talk a lot about this. I think something I'm picking up on in the conversation is just that there's just so many different ways to cover things now, and you don't have to do every single, no one person has to do every single thing. But like, I keep thinking back to even just like, a movie like Jordan Peele's Us from, I think it was last year, you know, and there was the, you know, I reviewed that movie as I normally would, and the review posted when embargo lifts. And it's kind of funny now when the review embargo lifts, you just get this, like, if you're subscribing to this, you know, sites, whatever, you get this little, like, your inbox is just full with boom, 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 boom. Here's the alert, you know, if for you know, for a major, quote unquote, major movie. Sure. There's a ritualistic quality to this now, and it almost is a little depressing because it just feels very robotic, right, too. And part of fun is breaking out of that robotic mold. And we talked about how, you know, I reviewed, you know, that movie early, and that's normally, and Eric, you know, from Indiewire, Variety, and Screen, and various in the Hollywood Reporter, and you know, maybe to a lesser degree, but still the LA Times now, this need to be timely and early. But that movie actually didn't start to get, you know, obviously wasn't seen for another few weeks and not talked about for maybe another week or so later. And so it's this sense, it's not just about like being first anymore. It's also like, it's writing about the movie at every sort of stage of its life. And if you didn't write about it, I mean, I did review it early, but I could have written something later. And you know, when Kenny was there, we often used to swap a lot. I mean, he reviewed Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but I came back later and I did this longer piece. And it's really kind of freeing. And maybe the opposite of freeing, because then it's like, you just feel like, you know, it's like, well, if you didn't do it, you know, you have to write about this in some way. So yeah, I think though that there is, you know, as we see criticism just increasingly shifting away from this, you know, daily or weekly review model, it's like there's you know, some of my favorite things I've written, some of my favorite things I've read are by critics who are not necessarily just writing reviews.
Right. No, that's a really good point, and a good segue into what I wanted to ask Ruby about, because Justin talks about this robotic process now, the media mechanism that sort of launches movies out into the world and tends to favor the ones where there's a lot of anticipation behind them already because of embargoes and big release dates. Even at Sundance, we see this. The trades, my own included, will, you know, try to hit these embargoes on whatever big films are at the festival and sort of drive that awareness. And I thought it would be worthwhile for you to talk a bit about kind of the cultural ramifications of that, because I see that you're doing this reunion panel at Sundance for your Barbed Wire Kisses panel that captured all these queer filmmakers at a really seminal moment their careers. And so many of them, like Todd Haynes, for example, had just sort of launched out of the Sundance ecosystem. But that Sundance universe was not the Sundance, certainly not the 2021 universe, but not the 2021 either. So can you talk a bit about that contrast? And do you think it would have been possible for a movie like Poison to break out at Sundance the way that it did way back when?
Oh, boy, I don't know. I can talk about a lot of these things. I don't know if I can answer that last question. But, you know, that panel, I mean, Lisa was on that panel as well.
Right.
And it was, I mean, I don't know. Do you want to say anything about that, Lisa, before I launch into some long roundabout thing? What do you think about that ever?
Oh, I think about how different Sundance was, and I certainly, I mean, the Poison question is a great one because that was such a sort of seminal experience for me, just in terms of Todd shifting. You know, it was just a big deal, and it was really interesting. And I was on that panel because you'd written such a great piece for us, you know, for The Voice at the time too, about queer cinema. So, yeah, no, you take it, you take it.
All right, all right. I just wanted to throw that to you though, because
Thank you, Dawn.
you know, I remember Derek Jarman was there because he was trying to escape his 50th birthday back in England. And so he was hiding out. And he said it was the first time he had ever felt accepted and comfortable and at home at a festival in his whole life. At a mainstream festival was that panel. And it was this weird coming out moment when all these people would stand up in the theater and say, you know, I work at Disney and I'm gay, and all these people would go, you know, it was really this kind of, you know, come to church, come to mama kind of moment. There were like 150 people there in the middle of a packed schedule. And I think it really had an impact. Does anything have an impact now at a festival like Sundance? You know, I don't know. I don't know the answer. But I think that it was a combination of a kind of Sundance coming of age moment and a queer film coming of age moment. And they intersected in this very, very beautiful way. That was exciting to be a part of. But I think it kind of indirectly relates to your larger question, because we're not just reviewing, we're also trying to have an impact. So how do you have an impact? How do you create a platform for work that you care about? Or how do you demand attention for issues that you care about? That's what I'm always trying to do. I'm always trying to look, I'm like a heat-seeking missile. You know, I'm always trying to find where the hot spot is and where to stand. And bizarrely, I keep trying to do that with Film Quarterly. And it's a quarterly, it's an academic quarterly. And I keep trying to do that. And so like this issue that's heading to the printer now has a piece by Sarah Kessler, who teaches at USC. That's really great. That's on the new Butch Middlebrow. And she's talking about Hannah Gadsby and work in progress and all of this new kind of figure in a way that I thought was really exciting. And I think will be fresh even though we're a quarterly. Or the current issue has a whole huge dossier on the new Brazilian cinema, looking at Black Brazilian film coming from outside of the Rio Sao Paulo axis, coming from the periphery, coming from the provinces, coming from the Northeast. And it's the whole cinema that got nurtured by Lula and Dilma and then has gotten kneecapped by Bolsonaro. And so I felt like that was a real contribution we could make to bring all of this together. And more than half of that dossier is translated. We got a lot of Brazilian critics, Brazilian writers, and I'm really excited about it. And also, I'll bring this around, a lot of them talk about the importance of the new film festivals in those areas that provided a meeting place for them, or what they actually called a Colombo for them, to come together and meet and talk about what these new aesthetics were and what these new approaches were. So I'm always happy if I get excited like that, you know, if there's something, some new work, some new idea, and maybe it's a new actor, maybe it's a new director, maybe it's a new cinematographer. But I think that we still have a function, which is to kind of, you know, hold the Klieg light and say, hey, look, you know, look over here, look over here, look over there. That's what a lot of us are doing with our words.
Well, speaking of new film festivals, let's talk a bit about the new film festival experience that we've all had over the past year or so. I mean, we're coming around to Sundance with months and months of various attempts to take some aspect of the festival experience, which involves curation, it involves marketing, it involves criticism, all these different layers, and stuff it into the digital void in this way that nobody was prepared for. maybe people were talking about in sort of abstract ways about how to experiment with. But suddenly the idea of this virtual film festival, as it's called, it's sort of a misleading term because we're not all putting on VR headsets, but it's the virtual festival model has been the way that the circuit has continued to function in different kinds of ways. So Randy, why don't you take us off on this one first, because I think it's worth talking a bit about, from a freelance standpoint, how did you sort of approach the new model that festivals were forced to adapt before the end of the first quarter of 2020?
Well, I think this is it's an interesting time because this is getting more access for people to see some of these films even. And so I think it's an encouraging sign in that way that right now you can go to the Roxy, actually has, it's a satellite place where you're going to be at the drive-in being able to see some of these films. I know that's not the same experience as saying like going in, and there's a thrill of going into that audience, not knowing what you're going to see, whether you really hate it or whether you really love it. I mean, that experience is hard to get through. So for me, the approach is that I started really uncovering even more of some of these gems that Ruby was addressing as well. I think that we've actually been able to spotlight these sometimes in a better fashion than when you have the big budget Hollywood movie coming out that you, whether you're being assigned, they're not coming out. So our role as a film reviewer can elevate some of these films in that way. And I'm seeing a bunch of rich things, and that applies to film festivals. From doing Frameline Film Festival, I was able to see so many films in that. I think that the curators of these film festivals have been challenged in such a way that it's really the hardships they've endured and what they've actually been able to assemble. I mean, even that we're right now, we're on this panel talking about this is pretty remarkable given what Sundance is really all about. I remember this last time being in a youth hostel, right? You're saying, where am I going to get a meal? It's going to be hot and everybody's too loud. And that we're still able to assemble here and talk about this is pretty remarkable of what they're doing for film festivals. And it's really hard. We were there at the San Francisco International Film Festival, just ready to open up. And they had worked so hard, and they were one of those that were hit really hard. So if any way that we can support those, and they're coming up with another season. So I think that there's a lot of things that we're doing as far as that helps move the needle. And they're doing a lot of different things with film festivals that we are having a little bit more participation than other people who might not have been able to go to it.
Pam, what's your experience been like with the virtual festival circuit?
It's, the two out-of-town festivals I go to are Sundance and Toronto. In fact, Randy and I were at the same hostel last year. And yeah, the sleep was not an option. But what I really miss is because those are my opportunities to network with people, not only to discover new films, but also to network with writers that I only see that 1 or 2 times a year. And so I really miss that. And also it's like I did Toronto virtually, and I just miss the city. I miss the writers. I miss theaters. I mean, I'm someone that's in a theater 3 times a week under normal circumstances. So not being able to go to a theater to have to stream everything has just been killing me. And at Toronto, it just really, really brought that home, because there were some, it's like that Chloe Moretz movie, the cloud movie. Shadow in the Cloud. Mm-hmm. That was a movie that was meant for a midnight audience at the Ryerson, clearly on a big screen with an audience hooting and hollering. I wrote a review, but I really miss that in-person experience.
Absolutely. And I always think of that being such a critical piece of it because, on the one hand, someone could argue that, well, it's a very misleading kind of environment to experience the exposure of a movie where sometimes if it has, a bunch of stars in it, the crowd will go wild, even if it's a real stinker. But there's something about that environment that also ends up sort of allowing people to work through in real time what the lifespan of a movie is really going to look like. Justin, you, as you know, you sort of explained the process through which a lot of trade critics work at festivals earlier, but when you go to a festival, you're not really anymore the kind of person who needs to crank out a lot of reviews. But that creates another kind of opportunity if you're at, say, a Toronto, in the sense that you can look at the big picture in a different kind of way. So how did, say, Toronto as a virtual experience impact that part of the process?
Yeah, it's I mean, it's wonderful to not have to crank out reviews. And yet it's funny though, because I've also done it the other way, where I think you know, when you go to festivals and you're not writing, that doesn't feel great either, because you're just, you need, the writing does help you make sense of your impressions, your reactions. It helps you keep the damn movies separate in your head, which is always hard. Toronto, I mean, I have to say, you know, echoing everything that Pam said, and that just we all miss that community so much. We all miss the physical experience of being there and seeing each other and having dinners and all of this. All of that aside, I was pleased, you know, it was wonderful to get to see, you know, not nearly as many films as Toronto would have shown normally, but, you know, shown, I have to say, in, you know, a really nice digital platform, without my email address blown up across the screen in a big as part of digital watermark, which would all talk about how annoying that is, and what contempt it frankly shows for our profession. But so that is, you know, and I wrote, you know, I didn't write a ton. The thing about this distinction, Eric, yes, but, you know, and I've done, it's been interesting to see how to do it both ways as a trade critic and editor, where it's just saturation cover, you know, where you're writing about every movie if you can, or making sure that every movie is covered. And at the only times where we're just providing a taster, you know, we're providing a bit of a preview of things to come, and, you know, and of course there is still the rush to focus on, yes, the prestige movies, and there's just that obligatory, you know, some of which are good, some of which are bad. But I try increasingly just to do what I've always tried to do, which is find those delightful surprises, those discoveries, even if I'm not writing about them at length. You know, I mean, the documentary MLK FBI, which is, this is pre-Martin Luther King Jr. Day. I know this conversation is probably being viewed well after that, but, you know, the MLK FBI is opening this weekend, and I saw that at the New York Film Festival and Toronto through their digital platforms, and I wrote a little bit about it then, you know, not a ton, but and it's wonderful to get to revisit that now. So yeah, it's nice. It's nice to be able to sort of sift through, not weigh in on everything, but see the things that are really worth calling attention to.
Carlos, why don't you tell us a bit about your experience sifting through things, because you don't usually go to the international festivals. So, you know, I assume that in general, Toronto has been a remote experience for you anyway, but how has the overall climate of the virtual circuit changed the kind of work that you do?
I mean, it's interesting. I feel like the sort of access that it has provided, like you say, you know, I couldn't have attended TIFF physically, so having it online was sort of like my first experience with that festival. And, you know, for many people, it was that way, you know, and I think that's what happening with Sundance this year, that so many more, you know, sort of like up and coming, or, you know, critics from underrepresented communities are getting their first taste of these festivals through the virtual experience, which, you know, it's really great, you know, for all of us to have access to the movies and be able to write about them. I do think that I'm glad that for something like Sundance, I've experienced it, you know, in person before, because, you know, like everyone's saying, it's a different sort of connection that you have with the films, with the experience, with how you write about them in that context. So the virtual scene has been, you know, interesting and a little challenging in terms of being a freelancer, trying to, you know, to convince or, you know, entice editors to find value in, in coverage for films that may not open for a long time, that also are not having a premiere, that are not having a Q&A, that don't have all these other sort of like, context that might make them, compelling for an outlet to want to write about them. So it's been sort of looking at these films and trying to figure out new ways in which to, to highlight them and still make them exciting without having the machine that goes with a film festival. So, maybe writing a think piece about a couple of films that have, connections or parallels between them, or, singling out a young actor that's been in one of those, which will be the same that I will try to do at a physical festival. But now with virtual, it has become sort of like trickier to figure out how to, frame those stories to still give them sort of like, an interesting angle. So yeah, I mean, I've enjoyed the flexibility of it at times. We'll see how it works out for Sundance this year, of not having to run from one screening room to another. That's definitely going to be nice, but you miss the, the Q&As and the sort of like the buzz and finding people in line and, recommending you something that wasn't on your radar, and that someone has been, like that happened to me in 2020 with the documentary Time. It wasn't on my radar, but people, the buzz just happened in line and on social media. And hopefully we can replicate some of that on Twitter or whatnot. But yeah.
Yeah, every year I go to Sundance, the question is, what's this year's the movie that got a lot of attention out of Sundance the year before? So last year we had Time and we had Minari, and these are films that are certainly still around. They came out in the last few months, but on another level, the sort of noise around them feels more diffuse than it did at that particular moment. Ruby, I'm curious from your perspective, what you make of that phenomenon, and even in sort of pre-pandemic times, the kind of life cycle of a film that seems to be a big deal at Sundance that then has to face the sort of broader challenge of getting noticed outside of that world.
Yeah, what people used to call coming down off the mountain, you mean? Like what was going to happen when it came off the mountain? I don't know that I can answer that, because I'm not so great at chasing that. I mean, I did see both those films at Sundance, so phew, that's always a relief. I think I saw you at Time, Lisa, in fact, at Sundance last year. But we all try to do that. The film that I fell in love with at Sundance last year is this tiny Lithuanian film called The Earth is Blue as an Orange. And it's put up in competition for the Academy Award documentary section. But it was one of the most brilliant documentaries I'd seen in years, shot in the war zone in Eastern Ukraine by a young Lithuanian filmmaker. But so sometimes I'm just blindsided by something like that, something I just don't expect, something that you go to see because it's in a time slot in the theater next to the one you're in. We don't really have that anymore now this year. Right. So it's going to be interesting to see how things shake out that way. I don't know. I mean, it's going to be fascinating. We don't, we're just walking into this. I do think Sundance has created an amazing platform that it's made a leap beyond the platforms we've all been using so far. So that should be interesting. But for me, I need like a Google Hangout surrounding me, or, my whole gang of friends on the other screen around it, so we can, be there next to each other while but you have to have friends who are critics with the same pass, who are going to go at the same moment. So you can both be, in your protected space at the same time. I'm waiting for that. Like, we all need that. We need our own screening rooms, not breakout rooms, actual screening rooms.
To remind people that there is a virtual reality component to Sundance that is basically inaccessible unless you are willing to take that plunge. And maybe the society and technology is not totally there yet for everyone to take that jump, but there is something happening there. So
yes, and I always go there, and I'm convinced I always get the flu because I go there. Because you put on these headsets that are completely enclosed that 18 other people just use, and they swab it out, but still. My partner told me I wasn't allowed to do that anymore because I get sick every year. So we won't get sick from VR this year.
Come on, it's the germiest festival ever.
I know it. Every time you walk in the door,
You know, it's the
I
termiest
know.
festival ever.
So, you know, it was a super spreader event avant la lettre.
I'll quote you on that one. At least what do you make of the Sundance buzz question, and how are you sort of looking at this most unusual year of Sundance?
Yeah, it's intriguing because, you know, I think that it's funny. It's like festivals are a version of being in a theater in a way. I mean, in a different way, which is that, oh, that's so experiential as well. And it's something that we have sort of been some degree robbed of by the pandemic. And yes, I think people are making really different and interesting decisions. You know, there's still buzz, right? It's like I read Indiewire on what movies you hoped would be there. I read you, which was really quite lovely, on what were, you know, some of the highlights that were going to be there. So I already have like some ideas of things that I'd be interested in that I wouldn't have known about necessarily, or not in the same way that like really puts it on my radar. But, you know, it took me the longest time to start trusting my gut again when I went to Sundance and not like troop off to like the thing. I mean, I just always remember, I'm not going to say which movie it is, but I just remember feeling like there was this like weekend where everybody had to go see this movie because the Wall Street Journal was going to cover it because it was like controversial. And I was so angry to be in that movie. I mean, like I really was annoyed. And that's a little bit like being a daily critic as well, as that you were going to have to report on that sort of outside of just like reviewing sort of thing. So I kind of learned that I have a pretty good selection of movies I see, and I'm happy to be pulled towards some other things that might surprise me. I think that Ruby's right, is that sometimes you go to something because it's the only thing in that slot, and it turns out to be like, oh my God, thank you, gods of like movies, for sending me to this thing that has changed my life, sort of thing. That's such a sort of special moment, I think. So that feels a little less likely because, come on, that's the thing. It's like part of the reason you want to be with other people in another space is that you don't completely self-select everything. And I do think that film critics, sometimes we sort of do kind of group select everything, and then we're there and it's like, oh, and plus it's really easy to just be at the Eccles if you have a particular kind of pass, so that you just like sit there like a catfish, like more, you know. and, and the hustle part of it, I don't think I'll miss. The buzz part of it is interesting, but I've also felt that one of the things I love about Sundance, and I'm curious how this will sort of translate, and it goes back to the comment about the anniversary of that panel, you know, those many years ago. It's just, I think of it as, it's the Great American Ideas Festival. There's so much in which film and the people that are making it, the documentary filmmakers, but the fiction filmmakers, there's so much engagement, so many things that are going on in terms of like how they are filtering the world back to us, how they're engaging it. And then just sort of this whole other sort of ideas fest that's built around it now, where last year I was like, oh, I should just go to Sundance for the whole thing. First part, I'll just go to all the like panel-y things, and then I'll see all the movies, because I don't feel compelled to like race to, you know, to everything and be the first one to write about it. I don't have that sort of platform, so there's no need for me to do that. And so I think that that's kind of a loss, but I do think it's going to be pretty interesting. I'm looking forward to covering Sundance as a virtual festival. This is the festival that I'm most interested in covering as a virtual festival, because it's the one I know sort of like in my body. If Telluride had had one, then that would have been a festival in which I'd be intrigued to sort of say, well, this is completely lost. But Sundance is different than, I mean, really different than Telluride in that regard. So it'll be interesting buzz-wise.
Well, that is a wonderfully optimistic note to some degree that I was hoping to end on. My sort of secret agenda is to find that.
Go to Kennedy. She's so naive.
But we all need to be a little naive to get through all, because of course it's a great step into the unknown. And I do think that one of the wonderful things about Sundance is that when you are there, one way or another, you can participate in the dialogue about what's worth checking out. And one of my favorite things to do would be to just go to a party, you know, and when somebody is looking for a recommendation, giving them something that is not getting a lot of attention, and then realizing that in that room you could see it as quickly as, say, you know, a virus, but with more positive results.
Yeah.
Is around. And hopefully
the pandemic.
You know what? Thank you. the pandemic effect. Hopefully, the year ahead that we've got here with Sundance and other festivals, we'll see some variation of that. And I would encourage people who are watching this panel to pay attention to all of these bylines that are covering the festival, whether their work runs during the festival or later, because that plurality of voices is really what keeps this process so vibrant. So thank you all for being here. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I'm looking forward to seeing you around Sunday, whatever form that takes.
You too,
Thanks,
Eric.
Eric.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Eric.
Great
Eric.
job, man.
Thank you all.
Nice to see you all.
Nice to see everyone.
Nice seeing you, everyone.